additional types of investigations called offline experimental investigations, including measurement studies and assembly and disassembly and component swap investigations. Note in the slide, you can see the link between the various types of investigations and the statistical engineering algorithm given in the flowchart on the right-hand side, and also the stages of DMAIC in Six Sigma. This will help you determine, as you're going through trying to find a solution to watfactory, what kinds of investigations you might want to conduct. And I'll say a little bit more about the statistical engineering algorithm at the end of this video. Now, interesting, to conduct investigations in watfactory, what you'll need to do is specify, of course, first of all, what type of investigation you want to run. And so that's given by the previous slide, where you need to select which particular investigation you like. As soon as you go to any one of those investigations, there will be additional choices you need to make. And notice that this is going to be quite different than most textbook problems in statistics courses, in the sense that usually in a traditional type assignment, you'll be given the plan of the investigation and the data and asked to do the analysis. Here, inside watfactory, you'll be forced to make decisions earlier on in the process, in the sense that you'll need to decide what plan to choose. In other words, you'll need to make choices about which inputs and outputs to measure, for instance. So you have to obviously trade off between cost and statistical ideas about what kinds of information you want to get from your process. In addition, you'll have to choose how many parts or how many camshafts you will make measurements on, and more specifically, which camshafts will you make the measurements on. Do you want to choose the next 100 camshafts that come off the production line, or would you like to spread those 100 camshafts out over a week, or somewhere in between? And recall that in the watfactory interface, that camshafts are made once per minute, so the camshafts will be labeled 1, 2, 3, and so on, representing their time of production, and that's how you will choose the particular camshafts you like. If you're conducting an experimental investigation, there are additional requirements. Because in an experiment, of course, you're not just observing, but you're deliberately changing something. So you'll need to specify which inputs you would like to change, to what levels, and when, and so on. So again, there's additional choices to be made. As I mentioned earlier, any investigation you conduct in watfactory will cost a certain amount of time and money. The types of things that influence the cost are, first of all, the type of investigation you run. Normally, experimental plans where you deliberately change things will be more expensive than observational type plans. The costs will also increase, as you might expect, linearly with the number of parts, so more parts will cost more. But costs are also associated with particular inputs and outputs that you decide to select and measure. There's a cost of $1 per part to measure any one of the output measures, Y100, 200, or 300. And the inputs also cost money to measure, and they range between $1 and $5, and the amount is given in one of the PDF summary documents inside watfactory that you can look at. In addition to the costs of measurement, there may also be substantial costs associated with tracing the parts through the process or tracking the parts through the process. So here the idea is, suppose I would like to know the value of X1 and Y300 on the same camshaft to get an idea, perhaps, if there's a relationship between those two variates or not. Notice that X1 is a varying input that acts far upstream in the assembly operation. In fact, it's a characteristic of one of the components of the camshaft. If I would like to know the measure of X1 and determine the final output measure for that particular camshaft, I would need to trace that particular component and particular camshaft through the process. This can be quite difficult in a real process, and in watfactory this is represented by an additional cost. So there will potentially be tracing costs associated with tracking that particular camshaft that has that particular component on it all the way through the process until after the heat treatment, where you can measure Y300. So tracing costs are something you'll need to definitely bear in mind, depending on what kinds of investigations you would like to run. Note that, as I mentioned earlier, there's a budget associated with watfactory. So whenever you run an investigation, the cost of that investigation will be stored in a database and be subtracted from your allowed budget of $10,000. If you're not clear about how the cost structure works, I would suggest that every time before you run an investigation, you ask watfactory for how much this investigation will cost, and determine based on that whether you still want to run the investigation. So determine the cost before you actually, say, conduct investigation and collect the data. Near the end of watfactory, hopefully you'll be getting down to looking for solutions. In other words, changes to the process that will make the process operate with less variability in the final output, Y300. There are many different types of solutions possible. There are these 5 options, the first 3 of which can be conducted simultaneously or together, if you like, and the last 2, due to limitations within watfactory, can only be done on their own. So the 5 different types of solutions are: you can change the level of 1 or more of the fixed inputs, in other words, Z1 through 30. You can add a processing step that involves 100% inspection, either on one of the inputs or on any one of the outputs. And you can also reduce the variation. If you determine one of the varying inputs plays a big role in the Y300 value, you can reduce variation in one of the varying inputs. Of course, all of these things come with a cost. Finally, there's also the option of feedback or feed-forward control, which I'll describe in a different video about how this is implemented in watfactory. For any one of these solutions, as I mentioned, there's a cost. And the costs depend on, first of all, the type of solution you're proposing, and then also the magnitude and frequency of the change that you're proposing. So, for instance, if you were changing one of the fixed inputs away from the current level, the further you move it from the current level, the more money it will cost inside watfactory. And if you decide to use a feedback controller, the more frequently you feedback and make an adjustment, the more that particular solution will likely cost. Just to give you some hints and suggestions for how you might proceed in watfactory, it can be a bit overwhelming to begin with because of the rich nature of the virtual process. The first thing that's very useful, I find, is to use a systematic problem-solving approach. Either something like DMAIC within Six Sigma, or the statistical engineering algorithm, the flowchart of which was shown in a previous slide. If you're interested in getting more information about statistical engineering, I would suggest you look at the book that Jock and I wrote in 2005 called Statistical Engineering. Next, to find a solution, you probably want to use the Duran idea, where you break up the search for a solution into 2 parts. First, you will search for a cause, the diagnostic journey, and only later will you actually search for this particular solution, the remedial journey. In either case, what you're thinking about when you're trying to solve watfactory is that you'll be doing a series of empirical investigations. You shouldn't expect that you can do one investigation and thereby find a solution to this problem. So you'll be doing a series of investigations. Next, you want to use only the process knowledge obtained within watfactory to help solve the problem. Now, the watfactory process is realistic, but it's certainly not real. So if you know something about manufacturing, in particular about camshaft production, you do not want to use that engineering type knowledge within watfactory. You want to use only information that's gained through the empirical investigations and the PDF documents that describe your background knowledge. Because of the fact that you're going to be using a series of investigations, it's very important that you also stay organized, in a sense that probably what you want to do is for each empirical investigation you run, you'll want to have a single file where you've stored all the results for that investigation, including the plan, the data, and the analysis that you've conducted and conclusion that you've derived from those analyses. Often you'll want to look back on previous investigations that you've run to help you figure out what to do next. And finally, when you're looking for a solution, often, as I mentioned, you'll do the diagnostic journey where you look for a cause first, and as you find a cause, if you find an important cause of the variability in Y300, you'll want to focus on the fixed inputs that act in the same processing step. That'll limit your scope of inquiry for the solution stage by looking only at a smaller subset of possible fixed inputs. I'm hoping that this video has helped you get started on watfactory. If you want to get more information, there are further videos available. In particular, there's a whole series of videos related to the various investigations that are possible in watfactory that show you the online interface and how to interact with that interface in much more detail. So there's videos on both the empirical investigations involved in looking for a cause and looking for a solution, but also there's videos on the interface for actually implementing one of the solutions, making a change to watfactory and seeing what happens. Finally, there's one additional video that describes in more detail the process improvement contest being run by ASA's Quality and Productivity section, and gives you more details about what evaluation criteria I will use to judge the entries for that contest. And finally, if you have further questions, please don't hesitate to contact me through email as given on this slide. Thank you very much and good luck.